The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, for 30 minutes.
Well, thank you. It's been about 6 weeks now since Congress last met, and I think it's time to review some of the major issues of the day that I do not feel the mainstream press is doing an adequate job of covering. We continue to have people stream across our southern border. The Biden administration has made some changes after 3.5 years, mildly reducing the amount. Nevertheless, in the most recent month available, we still have an estimated 145,000 people crossing the southern border per month. It's not difficult to go back to when the prior administration, and find monthly numbers 4 years ago of about 8,000 people a month. You can say that's due to COVID, but if you go back even before COVID, you would have monthly figures of about 11,000 people crossing the southern border. So we go 11,000 to 145,000, and that's despite the fact that we're pausing, waiting for another 30,000 a month to cross as they redo their parole programs. You have an extra 30,000 from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And in addition to that, we have another 7,000 a month in another program coming across from Afghanistan. Why do we not talk more about this, the scope of the problem? That we have 10, even after the reduction, 10 or 12 times as many people crossing the southern border compared to the last administration. And that's just the numbers coming here. In addition to that, we have the human tragedy of people coming here. The people drowning in the Rio Grande, which they don't report. The people drowning in the Pacific Ocean, which they don't report. The people dehydrating in the Arizona desert, which they don't report. Last time I was down there, I one more time asked the woman who was in charge of vetting or meeting the new people crossing the southern border, and she admitted a high number of women were being sexually assaulted as they came north through the lands that are controlled by the Mexican drug cartels. Where is the party that purports to be the party of women as these women are being sexually molested? These are issues that should be daily covered in the newspapers of this country, but the scope of the problem is not covered. There is no reason why this 140,000 a month, 150,000 a month should not be reduced down to 10 or 11,000 a month as it was 4 years ago. I would like to see a little bit more coverage by that in the newspapers. The next thing that should be talked about, while we were out, Mark Zuckerberg talked about the degree to which he was leaned on to restrict speech in his business. You know, freedom of speech is something a lot of us have taken for granted, although I'm a little bit afraid that the average American is beginning to waver on their commitment to free speech. Nevertheless, it's something that should be brought up as we head towards the elections in November. Is it appropriate that Mark Zuckerberg's huge company, one of the most wealthiest people in America, should be leaned on by the federal government to restrict free flow of information? And by the way, the more this happens, the more the American public begins to accept it, which is really scary. Share of U.S. adults who say the federal government should restrict false information, and of course, who's going to determine what false information is, has gone up from 40% to 55%. Over half of Americans think the federal government ought to weigh in on restricting false information. I think this is particularly a problem, sadly, with the Democrat Party. When I was a child, the Democrat Party prided itself on unfettered free speech, and they got into things like pornography and that sort of thing. Now, it becomes the Democrat Party more who is in favor of restricting speech compared to Republicans, 70% to 40%. Americans have to wonder, do we want to turn this country into a country more similar to the Soviet Union or Maoist China, in which the government decides what is truth and what is not truth? This is one of the things that makes America unique, one of the reasons why we're proud to be an American, and now people are beginning to say that this is perhaps not a good idea at all. But now I'll deal with the third issue that I think is incredibly important, maybe other than the southern border, the most important issue facing America today, and that is the breakdown of the family. There have always been people always say, mom and apple pie, everybody's favored, pro-family and wish they could have a mom and a dad at home. In fact, there have always been powerful people in history, beginning with the radical leftists in the mid-1800s, who felt the family was restricting and felt it's something that we should break away, destroy. This is one of the things that began to come out of the French Revolution in the 1780s. And to this day, some people view the French Revolution as something that should be looked upon favorably. In 1848, Karl Marx, and many people read Karl Marx to this day, believed that there was a need to abolish the family, and he put that in the Communist Manifesto. 50 years later, with the rise of the feminist movement, or 100 years later, radical feminist Kate Millay said that destroying the American family was necessary to bring about the cultural revolution that she wanted. So powerful feminists in the 1960s, a time of upheaval in America, a time when there were changes made in America, the radical feminists wanted to weaken the American family. And a lot of times people aren't that outspoken about it because I think the majority of Americans believe strong families are good. But there is a small minority, but very powerful minority, who wants to break down the family. Angela Davis, powerful radical, well respected by the hard left in the 60s and 70s and 80s, came out against the traditional family. Later on, Black Lives Matter, which exploded on the scene about 5 years ago, called for an end of the Western prescribed nuclear family structure. Think about all the businesses that gave money to Black Lives Matter. Think of all the prominent politicians, many of them in this room. Now they might say, oh, I wasn't for that part of their program, but think about that. People who wanted to get rid of the, quote, Western prescribed nuclear family, Black Lives Matter, all on board, and presented to be a positive thing. Now, to what degree has this institution, the American government and the U.S. Congress, played in weakening the American family? Beginning in the 1960s with the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson, who I think is the worst president we ever had, certainly until now, began a program in which an ever-expanding number of entitlements were doled out, almost conditioned upon not having two parents, usually not a father, in the household. George Gilder, the great sociologist and economist in the late 70s, wrote a book, Wealth and Poverty, about this program. And what he pointed out is that certain segments of society felt it was great when somebody got pregnant out of wedlock because they would be eligible for all sorts of government benefits, be it the food stamps, in particular, be it the low-income housing, tax credits there, which also benefited the very rich, be it the earned income tax credit, which is much easier to get if both parents are not living together, be it TANF grants, which also seem to be disproportionately doled out to families in which they get the man out of the picture. You add up all these programs, I'm told there are over 70 programs which in essence penalize couples who decide to get married. It varies from person to person, obviously, how many different programs they take advantage of. But it's certainly not unusual to have people suffer a $20,000, say, penalty if a couple who have had a child get married rather than living apart. Perhaps in the first couple of years of these programs, people were not aware of the effect of them, but they have unquestionably, over the next 40 years, next 30 to 40 years, greatly reduced the number of children without a mother and father at home. There was some progress made during the Clinton administration when Newt Gingrich forced Bill Clinton reluctantly to pare back some of these programs. But the programs are taking off again. Again, in his proposed budget, President Biden and presumably, certainly, Kamala Harris have tried to grow these programs, which are kind of conditioned upon not having two working adults in the home. I hope the press talks about this marriage penalty and forces our candidates to take a side one way or the other as to whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. But in any event, it has fundamentally changed the American family. I think in many ways it has made America a less livable place since these programs went into effect, since the Great Society went into effect. And the question is, should Congress, when they return in January, consider the fact that we are spending so much money to try to destroy the nuclear family, as the great feminists thought we should, as Karl Marx thought we should, as the French revolutionaries thought we should? Or should we step back from these programs, try to tailor them a little bit more, not to display the hate for the old-fashioned American, westernized nuclear family? I would hope that we would get some commitments that we are going to look at these programs. One more thing I want to address here for the American public that I think we have not dealt with the degree to which we should. A lot has been talked about the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. For whatever reason, as we write the history of the last 4 years in this building, we have focused on the Inflation Reduction Act, but not on other acts that also passed during that time period that are responsible for the huge amount of inflation that Americans are dealing with. Inflation that is, I think, weakening American families, because in an old-fashioned American family, you would have a house with a backyard for the children to play in. Now it's become increasingly difficult to afford a house, much less even afford food. So we have to remember there were actually 3 programs that were passed. Under normal circumstances, every year in this institution, we pass a regular appropriation bill, or what people back home would refer to as a budget bill, of about $1.7 trillion. And that's really too much because we keep driving our country more and more in debt. But in addition to the regular $1.7 trillion program, there were 3 other bills that were passed. An American Rescue Plan of $1.8 trillion, an infrastructure bill, and a few Republicans, irresponsible Republicans, voted for that as well, of $1.2 trillion, and an Inflation Reduction Act of another $1.2 trillion. What's not reported on and should be reported on is outlandish as these spending bills were. The Inflation Reduction Act was originally called the Build Back Better Act, and that asked for $3.5 trillion. If it weren't for the Democrat senator from West Virginia paring that $3.5 trillion down to $1.2 trillion, it would have been literally $2 trillion more. I think Congress ought to be asking the people, or the press corps, our slumbering press corps, ought to be asking the people of this building, do you wish that that act, which started out at $3.5 trillion and was reduced to $1.2 trillion, should we be adding another $2 trillion to that figure or not? Do you think it was a good or bad thing that Senator Manchin wound up weighing in and reducing that act to a still irresponsible $1.2 trillion. But I think it's important for the American public to know there was not reticence among the Democrat Party in passing it. They wanted a significantly more spending amount, and I can't imagine what the cost of a house or the cost of a dozen eggs or whatever would have been had they gotten that $3.5 trillion that they all seemed to want at that time. In any event, we've covered 5 other issues today, 5 issues that all candidates should be asked to respond to, issues that the press corps should be bringing forth so that they force Congress here to deal with these issues. I think when our forefathers wanted a free press, they anticipated the press doing a little bit of work on their own. So we hope that when we return next week, we read a little bit more on the difference in immigration laws or immigration people coming across our southeastern border between today and where we were at 4.5 years ago. I wish we would have more discussion as to whether penalizing people over $20,000 per couple for getting married is good public policy. I think we should be asking people if they come back here next January, are they going to want to add the other $2 trillion that Senator Manchin pulled out of the Inflation Reduction Act or Build Back Better Act? And is there concern as a growing number of Americans, including, by the way, the Biden administration, who apparently leaned on Mark Zuckerberg to restrict free speech? Are we going to see any more of this from those politicians who get reelected and are returned here in January? So hopefully over the weekend, some of these members of the press corps can wake up and cover these issues. But now I would like to yield.
The gentleman yields back.